The longest-standing inhabitants of Earth have been the single-cell prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea. Eukaryotes showed up in the fossil record just above 2 billion years ago, and it wasn't until the late Proterozoic that the metazoans, multicellular animals, showed up in the fossil record. With the breaking up of Pangaea at the beginning of the Paleozoic during the Cambrian period, there were a significant increased amount of transitional and shallow level environments. The climate was overall warm and the sea level high. Oxygen was at level comparable to present day. This promoted the radiation or rapid increase on biodiversity. For the beginning of the Cambrian, this is known as the Cambrian explosion. In the top map on the right side of the slide, you can see a map of the world as it would have been at the beginning of the Paleozoic, during the Cambrian. The lower side image is a reconstruction based on actual fossil finding of what one of those shallow water environments would have looked like. With the Cambrian, already all the major invertebrate phyla that we know nowadays were present. Perhaps the most famous place in which the Cambrian radiation, or explosions as we said, was ever found is the area in the Canadian Rocky known as Burgess Mountain. Burgess Mountain is the site of the Burgess Shale Formation. In the photograph below you can see Burgess Mountain, and on the foreground some geologists standing on the shales of the Burgess Formation. The specific place is known as Walcott Quarry. That is where at the beginning of the 20th century this formation was studied in great detail. Nowadays the findings from that historic expeditions at the beginning of the 20th century are stored at the Smithsonian Museum, and they're visible in the Ocean Hall exhibit. While the Burgess Shale Mountain is now on the Rocky Canadian Mountains, back in the Cambrian, that area was located on the northern shores of Laurentia, and the location was just south of the equator, as you can see in the small world map. If you look at the map on the left, you can see that the location of Mount Burgess in the Cambrian was basically the shelf slope break. You have also another representation of such an environment in the lower right side diagram. The yellow star represents the possible appearance of the Burgess Shale shallow to slope marine environment. It is thought that at this shelf slope break, at one point there was a significant massive landslide, submarine landslide, that is called a turbidite. Being far from the shore, this would have been most likely made of mostly mud and shale. The organisms that were living in that environment were therefore buried really quickly. This, of course, is a key element in ensuring the best preservation, rapid burial in very fine-grained material. If you look at the photo below that represents one of the findings of the Burgess Shale, you see a bivalve in the act of actively filter feeding. So this suggests that the turbidite hit suddenly, with given no time for the animals to realize the impending danger. Thanks to this accurate level of preservation, over 150 new species had been described from the sediments of the Burgess Shale. Of course, the Burgess Shale Formation is the historically most famous outcrop of this type of early Paleozoic or Cambrian biota. In this map of the world, everywhere you see a yellow dot, that is a place where analog and correlatable in age rocks similar to the one of the Burgess Shale have been found, and where many of the similar species have been identified. That's why we call them Burgess Shale type deposits. Let's now look at some of the inhabitants of the Burgess Shale. As you can see from the photographs and the reconstruction, we definitely can tell they are animals. We can figure out where their head is and probably in which direction they would have moved. However, they look quite different from modern animals. Consider these were found all within the same formation, so most of them were actually living in the exact same environmental niche. Size-wise, they were ranging from just an inch or so up to several inches and a foot. By observing these animals, we can also understand that certain relationship prey-predator were already well established. For example, the two animals you see in these fossils photos are extremely small in size, ranging between 1 and 2 inches in the largest specimen, but they do show spikes and ornamentation, we could call them, that are meant to deter predators. Speaking of predators, the famous predator of the Burgess Shale Formation is Anomalocaris, that is the genus. The photo here shows a very well preserved specimen of Anomalocaris. It is thought that upon that it would easily be dismembered by the scavengers and possibly other natural processes of the shelf break area. So in the case of the turbidite, many of those were preserved in their entirety. Reconstruction shows us the Anomalocaris canadensis, that is the species, was a very powerful swimmer. Reconstruction of the size, again based on actual finding, are represented in the infographics on the lower right, where you can see the average Anomalocaris size compared to the one of a 6-foot tall human. Almost at the bottom of the food web of the early Cambrian is Picaia gracilensis. Picaia is a very common fossil in the Burgess Shale and Burgess Shale type outcrops. Picaia had the size of a small worm, 1-2 inches at max. You can see at the bottom of the slides the photo of 2 specimens of Picaia and a reconstruction on the upper left. Picaia had an internal supporting structure that we call notochord. This makes Picaia the first animal of the phylum Chordate, which means animals that are supported by an internal structure. The phylum Chordate is our own phylum. Finally, on the top right is another example of range of sizes for Picaia compared again to a 6-foot tall human. So we can now understand what is the importance of the Burgess Shale Formation. Though these animals, as we have seen from the photos of the fossils and their reconstruction, look nothing like the typical animals we see nowadays, most of the phyla that are present nowadays on Earth are also represented with their ancestors in the Burgess Shale fossils. Also, the Burgess Shale shows us a very well-developed food web, as complex as the one that we have in the modern day, including all various levels of predators, scavengers, filters, feeders, grazers, all the way to the food production of algae. Let's now consider all the various sorry about that. Okay, so let's now look at the various themes of life at sea. And we're looking at the two kingdoms of the eukaryotes, Protista and Animalia. Let's start with the kingdom of the Protista or protists. These are eukaryotes, but they're not animals or plant or fungi. They're very common. We're looking at two groups in particular that forms important fossils. The group of the foraminifera, which are the single-cell protists that make a shell or test made of calcium carbonate. The other group is the one of the radiolaria. They make their shell out of silica instead. Both types of protists are microscopic, with the exception of some of the foraminifera that could reach 1 to 2 inches in size. Foraminiferas and radiolarias have been in the fossil record since the beginning of the Paleozoic, the Cambrian. In the two photographs in the slide, you can see examples of both foraminiferas and radiolarian from modern-day biotas. Foraminiferas are especially interesting for geology because they are excellent indicators of sea surface temperature, the planktonic variety, and water depth, the bentonic or benthos variety. Here we have some example of planktonic foraminifera. The two photos, the one on the left showing us the actual size of this type of organisms, and in the center you see a close-up of this specific foraminifera type. These are called the foraminifera from the Star Sand Beach. On the right side instead, we have some examples of the bottom-dwelling foraminifera, the one that we call benthos. Some of them have very nice color, different shapes and sizes of the shells. The colors are assumed to be the product of some kind of symbiosis between these foraminifera and algae. Let's also mention the most famous foraminifera of the Paleozoic, Fusulinid. Fusulinid is also an important index fossil that points to ages between mid and late Paleozoic. The shape of Fusulinid is also very easy to identify. Shape and size is similar to the one of long-grain rice, although the colors can be very varied depending on the diagenesis that put together that sedimentary deposit into a sedimentary rock. In the photo, you can see some Fusulinid fossils compared to the size of one copper penny. Let's now look at the kingdom Animalia and consider some very important phyla. We'll start first with the ones that are considered the best reef builders of the Paleozoic. In this slide, you can see for review the taxonomic ranks or taxa that we will use to describe these animals. We'll start with phylum. Think about phylum as a theme of life, a strategy that groups of organisms have developed to go through the history of life on Earth. Then we have class, order, family, genus, and species. The example you see in the slide is for the common house dog. So let's look at some of these very important phyla. The first one that we consider is the phylum of the Bryozoa. Bryozoa means moss-like or lace-like creature. Bryozoa are microscopic animals. They live in a colonial fashion, which means many of them within the same organizations and structure. Typically, bryozoan produce this net-like structure like the one you see on the top right photo. The animal itself would live at the nodes between that net-like structure. The bottom photo is a close-up picture of some alive bryozoans, so the animals themselves are worm-like tubes with very long cilia that they agitate in the water in order to collect nutriment. Because they can build this solid calcium carbonate structure, bryozoans are reef builders. Their mode of feeding is what we call filter feeding. These are some examples of modern bryozoans. There is quite a diversity of forms, but they all match very well, as we said, that kind of a lace-like appearance. The most famous bryozoans in the fossil record of the Paleozoic are Archimedes and Phenestellina. Though different looking, you can see that each of these photos show that net-like typical telltale appearance of the bryozoans. The second phylum that we consider is the one of the porifera, better known as the sponges. Sponges have been some of the most successful animals on the history of Earth. They've been around since the Cambrian and possibly even earlier, as some of the most recent evidence in fossilization studies are showing us. Their lifestyle, like the one of the bryozoan, is sessile. It means that they don't go anywhere. Their colonies, or in this case they can be individual as well, they grow on a specific point on the ground at the bottom of the sea, and they stay there. They might build on top of other organisms, rocks, debris, but they don't move. Sponges are also filter feeders. The way in which sponges filter feed is quite different from the one of bryozoans. The sponges absorb the water through their body. Of course, the seawater is rich in nutrients, and then expel what they have discarded, the discarded water, through the osculum, which is the opening on top of the structure of the sponge. Next phylum is the one of the Cnidaria. Cnidaria means soft body, sac-like body animal. Their range also is from the Cambrian to the present. The Cnidaria have several forms. Some are swimmers, as you can see there. Some can even be slight crawlers. For example, jellyfish, sea anemone. All corals are part of this phylum. Corals, in fact, are the most interesting for our course. Corals are our order of the phylum Cnidaria. The unique things about corals is that they build a cup or a theca around the soft body. The theca is made of mostly calcium carbonate, so it can easily fossilize. Corals are, of course, filter feeders, and they can be individual or colonial. Coral are also reef builders. Corals. In the slide below, you can see the individual corals called rugosa or horn corals. These individuals could be also 1 or 2 feet in height, so there was quite a range in sizes. They were, of course, filter feeders. On the right side bottom photo, you can see a reconstruction of an individual rugose coral. The final phylum for this section is the one of the brachiopods or brachiopoda. That means the animal with a strong short arm. Brachiopods did not develop an arm like what we think about an arm, so with bones and muscles. More than an arm, we're talking about a pedicle or an appendages of tissue that could easily anchor the animal to the ground. The animal itself would find protection by forming a two-valve shell, like the ones that you see in this drawing and the photos. Brachiopods, of course, start, like any of the phylums that we have discussed so far, with the Paleozoic, even with the early Paleozoic, and they continue to the present, although they were way more successful during the Paleozoic than they are now. One example of a living brachiopod is Lingula, the one that you see in the bottom left photo. You can see the top of the two valves and the brachium, again that pedicle, almost like an arm looking. In the case of the modern Lingula, that appendage is used to burrow in the sand. The brachiopods of the Paleozoic instead had the typical shape that we discussed so far with the two valves that were not exactly the same. One was wider, bigger, and had a hole through which the pedicle could be extruded. This type of shells looked very different whether you were looking at the top, the bottom, or the front or the back side, like you see in the set of 4 photographs on the lower right of this slide. In the larger photo of this slide, you can see a modern living brachiopod. The shell is open, you can see the animal inside, and you notice that the two shells look very different. They're not a mirror image of each other like, for example, in the modern typical bivalve clams. The symmetry of brachiopod shells, in fact, wasn't in between the two shells, but across the two shells, like is shown in the top left drawing. You can also appreciate that difference if you look at the top photograph that shows us modern brachiopods. So I'm drawing a green line representing more or less what is called the symmetry surface. So it comes across the two shells. The larger photograph shows instead how the brachiopods managed to build reefs. Because they would attach themselves to the substratum, they were not going nowhere. And generation after generation, they would build on top of earlier generation shells and therefore build up a certain considerable mass. So altogether, bryozoans, sponges, corals, and brachiopods were the 4 phyla that contributed to the building of the reefs of the late Paleozoic, the Permian Reef. We mentioned the Permian Reef as an important geologic structure when we described the geology of the Paleozoic. For example, in North America, there are leftovers of such large Permian Reef between the states of Texas and New Mexico. We also have seen these photos before, showing us the Guadalupe Mountains with El Capitan Peak in the foreground, also shown in the smaller photograph to the bottom right. As we look at the aerial photo, we can appreciate the immense size of the Paleozoic reef. The Paleozoic reef was significantly bigger than the modern reefs, even the largest that we have offshore Australia, for example, the Great Barrier Reef, pales in comparison to the size of the Paleozoic Permian Reef. Here is a general idea of what was the structure of such large reef. There was a reef core, that is the main body of the reef, built by those animals that we discuss today. So, again, the bryozoan, the sponges, the corals, and the brachiopods. There was a forereef, that was the area facing the open sea, that was receiving most of the energy from waves and currents, and possibly also the area with the most upwelling, which means nutrition in the water. And then there was a back reef. which would have found between the reef and land. This was the shallowest water, warmest and quietest water in the reef structure.